Yes. Okay, so my name is Sumanta Bagchi, and I am a faculty member at the ecology department in IISc, as well as in the climate change part of IISc. Um, I don't work on tipping points. I was a little bit surprised when the organizers invited me, but thank you very much. But I did encounter a couple of them once upon a time. So I'll sort of tell you a very general story about the empirical aspects of vegetation dynamics. Uh, Things like there are linear components of vegetation dynamics, and there are nonlinear components of vegetation dynamics, and put together they seem to fit within the ambit of this 2-week workshop. So thanks again. Now, we all know what vegetation change is, but there's a spatial component of vegetation, and then there's a temporal aspect. So if you go from place A to place B, you will encounter two different types of vegetation, which means there may be different species, there may be different types of the same species, there can be a lot of variation in who occupies what point in space. Similarly, the variation can also be extended into the temporal dimension. If you revisit a place time after time, you may see that things are changing. Species get replaced, new species arrive, existing ones go out, and sometimes there's a lot of turnover in who's occupying which slot at any given point in time. So this is work that I did quite some time ago, and here's an example of what happens to natural ecosystems if you care to observe them for long periods of time. So these are permanent photo stations in a place called Santa Rita Experimental Range in Arizona, which is in the drier part of the Sonoran Desert in North America. It's a relatively simple ecosystem, meaning there are very few players. There is some few species of grasses, few shrubs, almost no trees, and some cacti. So the number of players are relatively few. The complexity of the climate and the geography and the soils, everything else is relatively simple. There are much more complicated ecosystems than this. But if you have 100 years on your hand, then if you start taking photographs of this ecosystem from one location, so now I put a station here, I take a camera and then click a picture. So I have this in my view. So you four guys are sitting here today. I come back every year for about 100 years and I take the same picture every time at more or less the same season, and I keep recording these changes. You'll see it used to be like this. Then in about a decade, it was overgrown by these bushy shrubs, and then a few cacti came in and so on and so forth. And at some point, you will see that it's almost unrecognizable that the system started like this in 1922. And there are some speculations on why such dynamics have happened in this particular region and in other regions of the world. Here in Santa Rita, Arizona, one of the major culprits is supposed to be the great droughts of the 1930s and the little droughts of the 1950s, but that doesn't explain everything. So we still need to interpret several aspects that's in this picture, and we need to interpret the following. So what exactly has changed? Has something caused this change? And if we understand 1 and 2, can we predict what's going to happen next? So what will happen if I go back 20 years from now? What would that picture look like? Can I predict what that picture will look like? And that sort of confirms whether I understood the previous two questions, like quantifying what has changed and figuring out why it changed. So that's more or less the work that I had done. I didn't do it alone. There were lots of people who were part of the group. Some contributed ideas, some contributed resources, some contributed funding, and it wasn't just me. I'm sort of, don't shoot the messenger. And the long-term data, such as the one in the picture, come from various places, and these are sort of pioneer ecologists who took the trouble of establishing long-term ecological monitoring in North America about a century ago. So it's their labor that we are reaping the fruits of. And they established many, many such stations, and we got decade-long data sets to analyze and mull over from these places. Okay, so I've converted that into an animation here. So these are the pictures from the previous slide, and things are changing as you go from time 1 to time 2. Now imagine you have a 1 by 1 meter quadrat, which is permanently marked, and you go and count how many species are present at what time. It's the same location, and you go and make a list of species and their abundances. You'll find you can probably plot them as a time series. Some species were not there in the early parts of your data set, and then they became uh, considerable in their abundance. Others, like this one, they may have died out. Some remain remarkably stable and abundant. Some remain remarkably stable and low in abundance. So there's many things happening simultaneously. There are many players. Yes. It's what's left over after accounting for these 5 guys. It adds up to 100. So I didn't put a name for these. They're not unknown. They're just, each one is so little in abundance that you wouldn't be able to see the colors. So and there's some others, and then the rest of the community makes up that space. Everything adds up to 100. These are relative abundances so that we can compare across time, and the absolute abundances are slightly different, but more or less they follow the same pattern. So you can have a quadrat somewhere here, maybe a square or a rectangle or a transect, and you go and measure this over and over again. You can have time series such as this for one location in space, and if you have replicated your study, you will have an average of several locations. Now we need to make sense of what is going on. So the project that I worked on several years ago was trying to understand such dynamics in the drier ecosystems of North America. These are prairies in the south here. These are the desert prairies. And if you go slightly north all the way to Canada, these are more mesic temperate prairies. There was one site here, which is Mount St. Helens, which was a volcano, and it represents a case of primary succession. So in the 1980s, famously, Mount St. Helens exploded, and it sort of extirpated all the vegetation around itself. And then one of the collaborators, they went there as soon as the volcano settled down, and they started measuring what plant growth happens as the place recovers. So this is called primary succession, that you start from scratch and then observe an ecosystem develop. So number 10 was Mount St. Helens. It was sort of an outlier to see if what we understand from the other 9 also applies to number 10 or not. So many species are going up and down. So the first thing that we did was, in terms of analyzing the dynamics, understanding the change, getting a handle of what's really changing, we discretized the problem. Instead of individual species, we identified statistically consistent communities. So these are groups of species. Some of them are dominated by species 1, others are dominated by species 2. So this plot could be species 1 in time 1. This plot could be species community 2 in time 1. And then we counted how many times the composition of this guy flipped and became the composition of that guy. And we did this for every plot, every replicate for every year. So we have count of identities, and we have count of how many times they have switched sides. So think of them as politicians changing parties. And then we counted how many of these happen on a relative time scale. So if there were 100 total transitions from 1 to 2, 5.1 on average were from this kind to that kind. And then we have the reverse as well. This guy also flipped and came back to become F. So there's 5 going in this direction and almost 4 going in that direction. Some of these arrows are bidirectional, which means they go back and forth. Some of them are asymmetric. They go more on one direction and less in the other direction. Some are unidirectional. They only go one way. They don't come back. So from this, we tried to make sense of these transitions using concepts of alternative states, that maybe these are attractors. There's a natural tendency for species to coalesce and become this community. Once you become this community, you may attract neighboring compositions to become like yourself. Or you may be a repellent, that you coalesce but don't stay there very long, and you go and become somebody else. So things move back and forth between who you are and what do you consist of. These transitions tell us about something that some are common, some are unidirectional, some are asymmetric, some are bidirectional, and so on. And the big question is, does something drive an arrow? If something goes from here to there, it changes its nature. Is there a driver? And for empirical ecologists like myself, a driver is something that happens gradually over time, as opposed to a trigger, which is more of an abrupt thing, that it's not a common feature of the ecosystem, but something happens all of a sudden and it's a trigger. So we sort of use different vocabulary, different fancy words to make sense of whether something is slowly being pushed from one location to another or it's abruptly being kicked around. And then if there are thresholds, for example, this becomes that, but not the other way around. Is something blocking? Is there a gatekeeper which does not allow a community to coalesce in one direction, but it readily gives way in the other direction? So you can sort of make this an abstract picture and draw state and transition models. These are models that are increasingly being called upon to inform ecosystem management, because we can't really manage ecosystems under all kinds of anthropogenic pressures, like there's grazing, there's droughts, there's climate change, there's all kinds of things happening. So we can't really go and focus on individual species or individual members of the community. We abstract it out as communities. For example, we just call the communities with some letters. This is the one that we are really interested in, and you would like to avoid that. So maybe that's your management objectives. And these arrows help you navigate through 100 years of transitions that have happened on and are on the record. You can rearrange that diagram into a transition matrix as well. The diagonals here represent nothing has changed. The off diagonals represent frequency of counts where something has changed from A to B, and the other triangle is in the reverse direction. So we had lots of sites. So we had transition matrices for all of these, and again we asked the same question: is there any indication in these numbers that they represent alternative states? Are there any indications that some transitions are more likely to happen than others? Does something drive a transition or something triggers it? And then again, are there gatekeepers? Are there thresholds which can be crossed in one direction but not in the other? And the sites range from the diagram that I showed a little bit earlier. Okay, so that was discretizing the problem so that we could get our mittens around it. So it was lots of species doing their own thing, but we sort of grouped them in communities and then looked at what they were doing. You can have another tactical approach to the same problem, where you look at any one point rather than worrying about what community it belongs to. You just look at it in something called an ordination space. An ordination is a statistical tool which condenses the number of dimensions in the data to fewer numbers of dimensions. So suppose you have 30 or 40 species in a plot, you actually have 30 or 40 dimensions. But then those species' abundances would be correlated to each other, which means you can make linear combinations of their terms and compact that information into 2 to 3 axes or 2 to 3 dimensions. Those 2 to 3 dimensions may not contain 100% of the information compared to the original 30 or 40 dimensions, but they contain a substantial amount, which is often good enough to go ahead and see what exactly is happening. So any change in the location of the ordination scores on these axes tell you what exactly has happened, because you know the background correlation of which species occurs where along these two axes. So something like this. You go and do the ordination scores for this sample over 40, 50 years, you find that it hasn't moved very much. It has stayed where it was. Every year, year after year, its compositional score, its ordinational score stays more or less in a very small neighborhood. Whereas this guy started off here, went that way, then went for a walk and came back after 40 years. So these are examples of reversible dynamics. They went, they stayed there, and they came back. So these are like commuters. They go and become something else, but very soon they return. The amount of time spent in another neighborhood can be either very small or it could be a big chunk of your entire history, but they eventually come back. These guys are interesting. They wander off in one direction, change their mind, and go somewhere else. So they're sort of taking a random walk. And these guys are the determined folks. They start here and they go in one direction, they never come back. So they are very focused. They want to go from A to B. And then once they reach B, they stay there. They don't move very far anymore. Another way to look at the same information is see how far your sample went compared to its starting conditions. This is displacement. Let's say this is your starting condition. How far is this sample after time t1? And from there, how far is the second sample compared to where it started, and so on and so forth. So you make a time series out of the relative positions and their displacements, and you plot that. Heuristically, you can get about 4 types of behaviors. So one is the sample does not move very far. It sort of stays very close to where it started. It's not exactly at the same place, but it's not very far off either. Then there are these drifters. They start off and they wander in some direction, left, right, up, down, but they keep going. Then there are these folks who went somewhere, stayed there for a while, and came back. That's the reversible change. Then there are these guys. They stay here for a few years, then abruptly they go somewhere else and they stick around and they don't come back. I think this gray band is what's the primary focus of the workshop. So if ecosystems behave like they do in the previous paragraph, previous slide, then how, again, we come back to how do we figure out ways to manage these different dynamics, given that some dynamics are anticipated, some dynamics are not. Some dynamics are not good for management, some are really favorable. So these are familiar diagrams that are often used to make cartoons out of what is going on. These are called alternative states. So you can have an ecosystem go from point A to point B and stay there. There can be multiple equilibria, there can be attractors, something can drive it, something can trigger it, and then something in the middle will allow it to either come back or not come back. The diagrams can become increasingly complicated. It may be relatively easy to go from here to there. You go from a shallow basin to a deeper basin. It's relatively easy to go to your right, but it's more difficult to come back to the left. So you can have hysteresis and nonlinearity. These are practical problems faced by a branch of ecology called restoration ecology. Suppose this is a good ecosystem and this is a degraded one. Once it degrades, it doesn't come back on its own. So how do you restore? How do you manage the ecosystem back to what it used to be? And more importantly, how do you identify alternative states and have a count on your fingers? Are there 5 or are there 4 of them? And which ones are communicating or talking to each other? So this is the ball and cup heuristic. I think earlier in the workshop, Karen Abbott gave the mathematical description of these diagrams. So something like this, which has a very deep valley and the ecosystem is here, it doesn't bounce around very much just because of the shape of its uh, surroundings. It stays where it is, and those are the stable guys. But then you can have something like this. This could be one community made up of some combination of species, then it tips over. For a brief while, it is somewhere else. When it's here, it can either go back or not. But once it's there, it never goes back. Then you have wide basins where things just roll around, and occasionally you see all kinds of dynamics. So sometimes you encounter 1, sometimes you encounter 2, sometimes you encounter 3. So it just floats around like that. And then you have these drifters. There's a potential or a quasi-potential for the ecosystem to keep rolling in one direction. There's enough potential for it to keep going. They don't go in the other direction. So how much of what we saw in the pictures is actually happening, and whether can we categorize some of those dynamics into these neat boxes so that, again, we want to quantify what is going on and understand what's causing the change. And our motivation largely is what can we do about these dynamics. So that's what we did. So if you take the displacement or the dissimilarity from starting conditions, we encountered so many samples that stayed where they were. So these were the stable guys. They didn't move very far. Year after year, they stayed fairly close to their original location. These are the drifters. They started here, and every year they went further and further away. On average, they were on a linear, determined trajectory. These are the abrupt shifters. They were here, then suddenly they flipped, and once they reached that spot, they didn't come back. These guys haven't made up their mind. So they were going somewhere, then they reversed, they went again, and they tried to reverse, and then they started drifting. So they had many dynamics built into their history. So they were mix of several behaviors. This is more or less reversible. In ecological systems, you don't really recover 100% of it. They went somewhere and more or less came back, and now they were again off somewhere else. These we could not classify. They did not fit any of the other diagrams. So they were somebody else. And then we did this for every sample that we had everywhere at all the sites, from Alberta to St. Helens to Arizona to Kansas to Oklahoma, everywhere. And then we tried to do statistics to fit curves to their trajectories and then count how many curves fit in which category. So what we got in the end was something called the resilience profile, which ecosystems behaves like what. So these were the guys we did not understand. So the slightly yellowish ones, we had to give up on them. The lime green ones were stable. They did not show much change. Surprisingly, there's a lot of lime green in that picture. Ecosystems are supposed to be finicky. They're supposed to like bounce around. But if you watch them for 100 years, relative to what they can do in 100 years, they don't do much over decadal time scales. So surprisingly, while we are very worried that ecosystems are running away and becoming something else, there is a lot of lime green across many, many ecosystems. This slightly, what is this color? Purple maybe. There's a little bit of that, but not everywhere. Most ecosystems don't experience transients. They don't experience reversible change, but some do. They drift and they come back. The slaty blue one, they were a minority. There were not that many. These did not, they showed multiple behaviors. So some section of the data suggests that they were on a linear trajectory away from their original position. Some sections showed that they were on a reversible trajectory from a new position. But there were not that many. There's a few that drifted away. For example, this is a winter annual community. So this depends on winter rainfall. It's an annual community, meaning these plants are born the same year that they die. So depending on winter rainfall, they've had a history of drifting away from original conditions, not abruptly, but gradually and slowly every year from where they started. Well, here's the ones that we are interested in the seminar. How many showed abrupt shifts? How many potentially had tipping points in their past history? Not that many. We were expecting many more, and different ecosystems have different proportions of them. And then we were trying to make sense of why do different ecosystems have different proportions of the colors? Why are there more abrupt transitions in the tall grass prairie and not in the desert prairie? So what is it about the properties of the organisms that live here that explains this variation in their resilience profiles? So yeah, there's this answers a few questions, but there are lots of unresolved ones. One open question here is, if you look at ecological data over timescales of decades and centuries or close to centuries, and you organize all the history that an ecosystem has experienced, you'll find that these threshold events or abrupt shifts or tipping points are actually quite rare. We still have very little idea about what causes the different types of dynamics and what causes one ecosystem to have a different profile than the other ecosystem. Is it change in rainfall? Does vegetation get affected by climate, or is it the other way around? Climate gets more affected by vegetation. We also have a fair idea of the time it takes to reverse. Sometimes it can be about 30 years because the lifespan of the plants, the lifespan of the organism itself is about 20 years. So you don't expect ecosystems to return to what they were if you are dealing with long-lived organisms. If you're dealing with grasses that have they die only when they are 15 or 16 years of age, then you should expect reversible dynamics at an appropriate time scale. So demography and life history probably plays a much bigger role than we think they do. And then the next question, which ties up with time scale, is it hysteresis, inability to come back, or is it just long time to come back? How long does it take for us to correctly interpret the trajectory of ecosystem change? So yeah, that's all I had.
Hello. Hi. Yeah. One question at the back there. Yeah. No. Once you switch on, it takes a few seconds to become active. Maybe the battery is down.
Yes. So looking at the resilience profile, it is like concluded that the threshold events are rare. But I believe that this is all historical data you've investigated, right? So obviously, like in the past events, they have been rare, but the conditions now, they are changing at a much more rapid, like they are more rapid now. The drivers that are responsible for these transitions. So it may not be necessary that in the future events, these thresholds can be rare. Just I'm not sure. I think so. They might not be rare in future. They have been in the past. Just
Possible, yes. The start and end date of these data sets, they overlap, but they're not identical. So some are from early 1900s to 1970s, before climate change became
yes,
the real
yes.
point of discussion. Some start before 1970s and go up till 1990s. So they have encountered the major CO2
Okay.
era. Maybe that is one explanation of why these colors are not equal. And so, as I said, so we want to be able to quantify what is changing and understand what's causing the change. And as you say, can we predict what's going to happen? If we keep collecting these data, do we know what is going to happen? The third part is really difficult because we know that demography seems to play a role. We don't have theories which merge all of these together. We don't even have empirical data to fall back on to see whether demographic parameters are primarily responsible, and it's not climate, it's something else.
You showed that there were abrupt transitions in some of the communities. Can you comment whether they're reversible or irreversible? I mean, you can
Yeah.
see them.
So here, you start in 1954, you are here. If you don't have data after 1980, you may probably just, its beauty is in the eye of the, if you're looking for abrupt shifts, if you don't have this information with you, this begins to look like that. But it came back.
What about the B?
Which one?
Nonlinear.
Abrupt nonlinear. It attained a composition which was very hard to dislodge. Probably it got dominated by a single species which outcompetes everybody else. And it's very hard to dislodge it from there. But we don't know if this phase, which has lasted 4 decades, will eventually come back. Or no, we don't know what's the time scale relative to the organisms. It's very variable and seems like all bets are off when you go down to demography and identity of the species.
Can you say those two states are alternative stable states or not from this data?
Well, if we say that no more ecosystem dynamics are allowed after 2020, this is frozen in time, then you would be tempted to say that this was one state and it didn't take very long to go from here to there, although there was a bit of a pit stop. And then once it got there, it is alternative. It doesn't come back. So it's possible to make those interpretations. We don't know what's going to happen next because here it changed. And sometimes it's alternatively stable for 4 decades. Sometimes it's only alternatively stable for 7 years. And these are not space for time substitutions. It is repeated measurements from the same location. So for example, if you had started collecting data on ICTS campus in the 1990s, there would be paddy fields or some other vegetation. Today there are lawns. So you're not measuring two locations in space, you're measuring the same location multiple times. And these are permanently marked quadrats where people have diligently gone and built these long-term records. Some of these plots, I'm expecting a few people among you would have some familiarity with history of ecology. So there are people like Frederick Clements who are considered founders of many aspects of modern ecology. They were involved in some of these plots. So the first plots were laid in the 1920s by some of the people who gave rise to ecological thought. And then their descendants have kept these things going. But yeah, so the short answer to your question is we don't know if we see something, whether to call it hysteresis or transience, whether to call it an abrupt shift or a potentially reversible shift that's just playing out over a longer time span. But from a pragmatic managerial perspective, at some point you need to make a decision whether you need to interfere, you need to intervene and change the management, change something about the regime so that you get back the ecosystem that you desire and remove the state that you're not very fond of. Yeah.
So you mentioned something that state transition model, and there were some numbers connecting those boxes. So what are they?
So they are frequencies or relative frequencies of occurrence of a transition going in the direction of the arrow. So if there were 50 transitions in a data set, 2% went in that direction or 3.7% went in that direction.
Okay, thanks. Another question. Yeah, can you comment on this time scale for reversible change? Like, do we have any empirical evidence or anything like for the life history of the species and the time it takes?
We have complicated evidence, which looks like this. So this ecosystem is southern semi-arid prairie in Texas. It's dominated by 4 to 5 species, of which one is actually really dominant. Here, there's lots of dynamics on either side of the diagonal. Very few species and very long-lived. The major plant here is called Hylaria. It's a short grass, very drought-tolerant, can tolerate grazing. Even if you don't get summer precipitation, this grass can do very well under winter precipitation. So in this type of ecosystem, given such life history and traits of the species, it shifts around a lot. It goes back and forth. So, state called A1 to D1 happened 49 times, and D1 to A1 happened 56 times. So more or less balanced on either side of the diagonal. But if you go to another, this is a cold temperate ecosystem with similar dominance pattern, but a different species, slightly taller, more dependent on winter precipitation than in summer, even though it doesn't really grow in the winter, it stays dormant, it builds up its below ground reserves, mostly zeros for most of the values. There's only a few transitions which are allowed. So connecting these dots, because they're spread over a wide universe of potential traits, potential properties, whether the organism is short-lived or long-lived, how dominant is it in its community, sort of, we lose predictive power. We sort of look at this and say, we understand something, but what's going to happen next, that we don't know.
Thank you.
I have sort of a naive question. Can you go back to that movement trajectory slide?
This one?
No, the one with a lot of plots in it, where you distinguish between different dynamics. This one, yeah. I was wondering how can one make one plot is qualitatively different from other, like suppose C and F.
We use statistical cutoffs, nonlinear regression models, and some new techniques to determine what is goodness of fit for a nonlinear curve. So I and my team had to develop some of the tools to do what you asked. For a linear regression, we can easily understand what is goodness of fit, what is R square, because explained variation plus unexplained variation equals 1. But if it's a curve, goes up and down, or just a spline, then those two numbers don't add up. They are not 1. So we had to develop some tools and techniques to figure out, is there a quantitative difference between a curve which fits these data and a curve which fits those data. So the way we did it was, we had 6 types of curves to fit, and we fit all 6 to each one of them, and then we picked the one that was the best fit. So this curve was fitted the equation for all those lines, and then the winner was the one which was the stability curve, and so on and so forth, iteratively for all the samples in time across all the sites in space, and then aggregated together into that portrait of colors.
Is this working? There we go. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I work in kind of a similar kind of context, but in lake environments, trying to identify whether regime shifts have occurred through tipping point based, or whether it's stepwise changes and such like. So I really appreciate your particular last point, whether regime shifts are as common as a lot of kind of the theoretical kind of work suggests. And quite a lot of people are discussing whether actually transients are dominant in that circumstance, when it's complicated more by the unified climate change aspect on top of that, leading to directional changes. But in your example, I was wondering whether, do you have any information on what potential drivers may be for your particular system, and what the potential drivers may be, as that might clarify whether these systems are responding nonlinearly to the drivers?
What drove these ecosystems to behave the way they did? For a few of these sites, there are very closely matched weather data available. So say, for example, Santa Rita experimental range is thousands of acres, huge space, and there are valleys, there are hills, there are mountains, there are ridges, and whatnot. There's local weather variation in that entire range. There are enough weather stations there to closely match what was the history, what was the climate history for 40 to 50 years for any sample that you are looking at. We know only one thing from investigating potential drivers. In an ecosystem which is naturally very dry, an unusually wet year sort of has a big impact. Reverse in the case of an ecosystem which is naturally more mesic. There, drought has more impact. So the species which respond sort of out of the box, they jump out and become dominant. These are the species which are in the desert and they responded to three or four consecutive really, really wet years. And they were very difficult to dislodge even after rainfall became normal. Same thing, but the opposite in Montana, where you had 3 to 4 years of drought, followed by one good year, and then again 3 to 4 years of drought. The species which overtook the ecosystem became very difficult to dislodge even when normal years returned. So I think it'll be hard to build a predictive model for these ecosystems with the average in our minds. I think we need to think of the variance and do like a probabilistic understanding of here's the potential outcomes. And more often than not, we'll find an ecosystem somewhere between the upper bound and the lower bound, even though we can't have the power to predict where exactly the mean or the average will be.
I was wondering whether in your ordination analysis, you could introduce some of that environmental information, which might help clarify whether in response to your kind of linear changes in your environmental drivers, whether those clusterings have resulted in jumps and whether there's potential hysteresis in there.
I haven't tried it, but would you like to try?
So I've done a little bit in the lakes, and this seems kind of a perfect system for that because you have very localized potential drivers in it.
Sure. These data are available. I can give them to you. You can play around with them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's the baggage we were carrying on our backs when we started the project. Billion-dollar livestock industry in North America was very worried that their ecosystems are falling apart. Climate change is doing things to them, the erosion and warmer temperatures. So we went in looking for lots and lots of abrupt shifts. They were there, but not at alarmingly high numbers. And I think the baggage which had accumulated was from evidence in coral reef. Very frequent incidences of doesn't take much to kick a coral reef into an alternative state. It happens very frequently. Similarly, estuarine salt marsh was another source of our expectation that these ecosystems should be doing the same thing. Forests, surprisingly, if you have a couple of drought years, they suddenly huge die-off in certain tree species, and regeneration back to normal conditions doesn't happen in the lifetime of the researcher. They are called abrupt shifts. We went in looking for abrupt shifts, found a few, not. I think again, organisms which live 12 to 14 years, they will encounter droughts and floods in their lifetime. So I think the desert organisms, the desert plants are adapted to the lower or the worst year. Drought doesn't cause much, but the mesic plants are not adapted to the floor, they are adapted to the ceiling. I think instead of the mean, if we start thinking about what's the range of outcomes, upper bound, lower bound, we may get close to the answers for the questions you guys asked, which was very nice.
Okay, great. That's very insightful. Always looking at real data. I actually, in the end of last week's school, I gave a sort of, summary, sort of, discussion thing on, use what does data tell? And I think, I should include your data sets.
So this is a gold mine to ask some of the questions. It's observational data. We didn't interfere and change the climate, but maybe there was a drought between these two pictures. And there was another drought between those two pictures. So if you piece together the puzzle, it begins to tell you some things, but it doesn't answer all. Yeah, it's the same individual. It was a baby and grew up. So this cactus was on its way out. Now it's dead. So it's a time lapse. It's a picture. It's a time lapse. So and then somebody bothered to go and put a quadrat here and mark the corners and diligently collected plant species, plant composition. And then the people, for example, Peter Adler, he's been using the same data to understand demographic responses to the change in climate that was part of the history. Bestelmeyer's been involved with, you worked with him again. Place to place, it varies. So Santa Rita, it's every 3 years. It takes a lot of funds to go, and then people retire or they die. And you're looking at centuries time scales, and typical lifespan of an ecologist active is 20, 30 years. And the taxonomy is challenging because every generation of researchers has to be trained and sent to field, and somebody has to clean up. So in some places it's every 3 years, some places it's every year for many years, and then the person retired and there was a gap and then somebody else picked it up. So it's not like clockwork, but still very good.
Since you mentioned that the timelines were different for different measurements, could that explain the difference in potential drivers? Since initially there were droughts, like you said.
Yeah,
but
so some places the data started before the Dust Bowl drought. And in other places, the data start after the Dust Bowl drought. So if you look at displacement relative to origin, now the question becomes, is that origin really an origin, but would that origin be somewhere else had you started 20 years earlier? So, but while you were observing that ecosystem, this is what it did. So forecasting, backcasting, we face the same problem.
Yeah, so if there are no more questions, let us thank Sumanta for a very nice talk on how data of communities show tipping points. Thanks again. So we